Hello. Happy Friday the 13th. Today we're going to be talking about Dracula, and by Dracula I mean Makt Myrkana, the powers of darkness, the Icelandic translation of Dracula that's also kind of an adaptation and also kind of its own thing. We're going to be talking about the plot differences and the character differences between the original text of Dracula and this other version. So I should preface this by saying, first off, that I am not a Dracula scholar. I'm just someone who thought it would be fun to do a radio play of it. So I'm not really going to be going into the background too much of both of these stories, or looking at the sources for Makt Myrkana. I'm more going to be talking about the story differences. And also I should mention that I'm going to be giving some spoilers, actually quite a lot of spoilers, basically spoilers for both texts in their entirety. So if you're at all worried about spoilers, I highly encourage you to go and read both novels before watching this video. Although once you've read both novels, you probably don't need to watch the video, because you'll already know what happens. Anyway, Makt Myrkana was published in 1901 by Valdemar Ausmundsson, and apparently it did draw heavily upon a previous Swedish translation, which, if I ever read that, I might do a follow-up that's a bit more about the differences, the sort of links between these different texts. But for now, I'm confining myself to matters of plot. So it's published well within Bram Stoker's lifetime, and I don't know what the copyright lawyers thought of that. I'm not a lawyer. If you want legal advice, talk to Jonathan Harker, not me. Speaking of Jonathan Harker, he is not Jonathan in this version. He's Thomas Harker. Thomas Harker goes off on a trip to the Carpathians, to Castle Dracula, on business, and things quickly start going a bit awry for him. He realizes that there's just something a little bit strange about his host, and his eating habits, his sleeping habits, his manner, and he kind of can't tell what's a cultural difference and what's really an alarm bell. But things start diverging pretty quickly between the plot of Dracula and the plot of Makt Myrkana, because instead of being assailed by 3 vampiric women while he sleeps, Thomas Harker just goes down a corridor one day and meets this woman and chats with her, and he notices that she's incredibly beautiful and says that that's not something that he usually remarks on. He's known for being quite impassive and reserved. In fact, he's only ever loved one woman, and that's Wilma, his fiancée, the Mina equivalent. So he's very much a one-woman man, but she has this strange allure to her. She makes some comments about his appearance as well. She says he looks very handsome and masculine, which will be a good thing for him in the Carpathians. And he's a little bit disconcerted by the whole conversation. He mentions this woman to Count Dracula, and he says, "Oh yeah, that's my cousin. Don't worry about her, she's crazy. She thinks she's her own great-grandmother, that's why she wears that old-fashioned gown. She's gorgeous though, isn't she?" And then he goes on at length about how beautiful all of his female relatives have been. Harker is understandably a bit creeped out by the whole thing, and the plot kind of goes on in the same direction as the original. There are a few scenes that are identical, like he cuts himself shaving and the Count flies into a frenzy and throws his mirror out the window. So that's the same, but then there are these much larger differences, like Harker goes down to the basement of the castle and sees this temple where human sacrifices are being conducted. So Dracula in this version is less on his own with his 3 useless roommates who try to eat his food, and much more part of a community of vampires. And Harker also finds letters that sort of hint at a larger conspiracy between various European nobles and diplomats. He doesn't find out too much about that. He's also being framed for murder, because there's someone out there who looks exactly like him who's been killing people, and he realizes that's so that if he manages to get out of the castle, he won't be able to find anyone who can help him. And that happened a little bit in the original, where the Count goes about in his clothes and everything that he does, every nefarious deed, is attributed to Harker because the Count is impersonating him. So it just happens a bit differently here. Anyway, eventually Harker does get fed up with the whole situation, and with the mysterious vampire lady psychically calling out to him, because she does that as well. He decides to make his escape, and that's the last we hear from him for a while. That's where his journal ends in a sort of cliffhanger for a bit, and we don't see him for some time. And that's where the book does something very strange, because that's where it switches from a first-person perspective to a third-person perspective. So the original is all diaries and letters and newspaper clippings and transcripts of wax cylinders, telegrams, all sorts of different notes, receipts at one point. Anyway, we don't get that. We don't get Mina's wonderful journal entries where she records things in so much detail that they're really useful for piecing together what's happening later on. We don't get Lucy's ebullient letters. We don't get Quincey's invitation to a party. We don't get Arthur's telegrams. And we don't get Dr. Seward describing in great detail how hot all his friends are. Which is such a shame. What we do get is a much more distant perspective and a much more hurried sense of plot, where everything's described very briefly. It's very laconic, to borrow a term that Bram Stoker liked quite a lot. And it all sort of feels like an outline that was sketched in where someone thought, oh yes, I'll come back to this later, and then just never did. So we get the holiday scenes of Wilma in this case, which actually has a name change that makes a bit of sense because Mina in the original is short for Wilhelmina, and it's conceivable that Wilma is as well. And her friend Lucia Western, who is the equivalent of Lucy Westenra. And they're having a lovely time. Lucia has just been proposed to by 3 men, and she chose Arthur Holmwood, so that's the same as the original. It's also mentioned that Lucia is prone to sleepwalking, but unlike in the original, we get the explanation for this, that it's because her father was promiscuous. We don't really find out anything about Mr. Westenra in the original texts, so this is a bit of a departure. Anyway, Lucia and Wilma are having a lovely time until this one night there's a storm and a ship drifts in with no living crew, only the captain tied to the wheel with a rosary, who had recorded this log of everything that had happened on board. And this is quite a long section in the original book. It's less than a page here. It's just described very briefly, although there is a really beautiful image of the sea boiling like a geyser, which is a reminder that this is an Icelandic author writing this. So I love that. I love that so much. Anyway, the ship arrives, and shortly after that, Lucia's sleepwalking habit comes back, so thanks a lot, promiscuous Mr. Western. Following that, Lucia's uncle arrives, who is not in the book, in the original book, and he's accompanied by a friend who's very much not Count Dracula in disguise at all, and they take the girls to go get their fortunes told. Everyone goes on about what a gift Lucia has for fortune-telling, although this never really comes up afterwards. And she's shown a crystal ball, and looking into it, she sees her fiancé Arthur kissing a young woman who's next to him, and that's his sister Mary. And Mary has just made an engagement. She's just gotten engaged to Prince Coromezzo, who is this Austrian diplomat, but he's a bit of a bad boy. He's got a bit of a reputation, and her whole family tried to dissuade her from this match, but she went ahead and got engaged to him anyway. So that's all we find out about Mary Holmwood. She's not in the original book either. Anyway, Lucia is a bit perturbed by this and by the whole sleepwalking thing, and she seems to be starting to suffer from this mysterious illness. But Wilma's quite worried because she hasn't heard from Thomas in a long time, and she doesn't think that that's a good sign. She ends up going to Transylvania herself in this version. She goes with an agent hired by the law firm that Thomas works for, and they're joined by Mr. Hawkins, the head of the law firm, and this police detective. So the agent's name is Tellet, who doesn't really play a very large role, and the police detective, I think he's a police detective anyway, his name is Barrington, and Barrington ends up playing a much larger role, or at least he's included in a lot more scenes, and I don't really know why, because he's not a very interesting character. He mostly is there to sort of doubt that there's something supernatural going on. So he kind of gets Dr. Seward's role of being the skeptic in the group, but without any of Dr. Seward's more interesting traits, without any of his neuroses or self-doubts or the whole sort of ethical mess that is his situation with Renfield, or his complex relationship with Van Helsing, or, again, his lengthy descriptions of how attractive all his friends are. None of that. He's just there to try and provide rational explanations and do some investigating, which never really becomes relevant to the plot. So they all go to Transylvania, and they find Castle Dracula empty. But when Wilma's exploring the castle, she goes up some stairs, and this invisible force flings her down. So she's quite badly injured, and they need to take her to a hospital. And they arrive at this hospital that's run by nuns, and I think you can tell where this is going. She starts bonding with the head nun, Sister Agatha, who tells her that there's another patient from Britain in the hospital. He's been suffering from brain fever, he's lost a lot of his memory, but he keeps talking about this woman that he loves. So Wilma starts corresponding by letter because her leg is injured, she can't get up and walk around. She starts talking to this patient, and eventually, when she's able to get up, she goes into his room and realizes that it's her Thomas. And he recognizes her, and they have a lovely reunion, and it's all very romantic. And then they go back to England to recover. Meanwhile, Lucia is rapidly declining, and nobody can figure out what's wrong with her. Her fiancé Arthur calls in his friend, who also proposed to her at one point, Dr. Seward. So the whole plot point with the three suitors is included, and it's mentioned that they remain friends. They're still on good terms with each other and with Lucia, despite her turning down two of them. So Arthur calls in Dr. Seward, who can't figure out what's going on either, so he calls in his old teacher, Dr. Van Helsing. Van Helsing arrives from Amsterdam, but he keeps having to go back and forth between the two, so he's not always there and he can't always be helpful. As a result, Lucia keeps sort of declining, keeps getting worse, keeps losing blood and needing transfusions. So they get, same as in the original book, we get the 4 transfusions from each of the suitors and Van Helsing. Quincey Morris arrives just in time as usual, but it's still too late to save Lucia, and she dies. She begs the others to protect Arthur, first off, to look after Arthur, and also to give her peace. And it's here that it becomes a bit strange, because this is such an important line in the book that, she wants them to give her peace, and that in the original translates to staking her as a vampire so that she can rest in peace. In this version, it's a little different. So the night before Lucia's funeral, Dr. Seward is in bed, and he hears this crashing sound coming from the room where Lucia's coffin is, and he goes in and finds Arthur unconscious on the floor. So he tenderly carries Arthur back to bed, and Arthur explains to him, very distraught, that he had been woken up by Lucia coming into his room perfectly alive. She'd gotten out of her coffin, she was fine, and he wasn't quite sure what happened after that. But now he's very worried that they're about to bury her alive. So Dr. Seward and Dr. Van Helsing go and try and revive Lucia, and they can't do it. So they just leave blankets and water beside her coffin in case she actually is alive. And so there's this very, very interesting indication of this fear of being buried alive there, which is kind of present in the original book, where after the fact, when Lucy has been buried and Van Helsing's trying to break the news gently that she's a vampire, he says at one point that she's not dead, and Arthur takes that to mean that she was buried alive, and he's horrified, but what Van Helsing really means is she's undead. So that whole thing seems to be setting up a massive confrontation with the vampire Lucy, as there is in the original book, which is never followed through on. That's the end of that plot line, and I don't know why. In the meantime, Dr. Seward goes back to the asylum and is doing his usual work when he's called to the house next door to treat this new patient, this newly arrived noblewoman from Europe. And he goes in, and in classic Seward fashion, he's flustered by how incredibly beautiful she is. Yeah, actually, at a couple of points, her clothes are pointed out as being a bit pretentious, which I really enjoy, because sure, you may be a vampire with incredible powers, but none of that can buy you taste. She explains that she suffers from this ongoing condition, and he promises to treat her, but it's a little unclear. Like, she seems to kind of hypnotise him and sends him sends him back to the asylum feeling very woozy and odd, and he takes chloral that night to get a good night's sleep, which again is a detail that's carried over from the original. But the next day has to sort of pull himself together to do his job. Later on, he's invited to a dinner party over at the same house, and he goes over. The place is full of fancy guests, very much from the highest echelons of society, all these important people, and they say that they're going to teach him something about hypnosis, which he's very excited about because this is, of course, cutting edge stuff. This is all new and thrilling medical science. But then the Countess, the woman that he'd been called to treat previously, goes behind a curtain with this man, and they disappear for a bit. Dr. Seward goes into a sort of trance and then comes out of it. They tell him, "Oh, you fainted, so you didn't learn anything about hypnosis. Never mind. Go feel better, and we'll teach you another time." So he goes back to the asylum, and then he's not really heard from for a while. And these sections are supposedly based on his journal, and it's just noted that this is where his journal ends. Not a good sign. They send in Quincey Morris to try and investigate what happened to him, because if an asylum doctor goes missing, who do you send in to try and save him? A cowboy. Quincey Morris also just goes missing for a bit, so they send some other people to try and figure out what happened, and it's discovered that the asylum is in complete pandemonium. Quincey has been injured by some unknown external force and looks absolutely gaunt and half dead. Dr. Seward has gone mad, so that explains what happened to him. And you might be wondering, in all this asylum business, where is the most significant asylum figure? Where is Renfield? And the answer is he's nowhere. He's not in this version of the book at all, which is kind of interesting because he's such a significant person in the original, and then in this version he's just not even a character. I guess in a way you could argue that his role is combined with Dr. Seward, because he becomes a patient at the asylum. Not for very long though, because they're removed to another hospital and then the asylum burns down. Nobody ever finds out why. The action really picks up then because Van Helsing, Thomas, because Thomas Harker has come back. The Harkers have come back into the plot, and Thomas is joining the Dracula hunting party. Quincey and Barrington, and I think that's all. I don't even think Arthur is included in this. Poor Arthur. They decide to go over to Dracula's place and to kill him. So they break in and they find a great big stone sarcophagus, and they wrench the lid off, and there's the Count asleep, but he starts waking up as they open the box, and so he reaches out with his nails and starts attacking and clawing at Thomas, but then Van Helsing stabs him, so it's okay. And that is the end of Count Dracula. There's a little conclusion, there's sort of a wrapping up of things. There's a police investigation. Quincey Morris confesses to the murder, but nobody really cares because he's a vampire, so he's acquitted, and that means he gets to survive this version. So in a way it's a happier ending, but in a couple of other ways it's not. I mean, first of all, Vampire Lucy is probably still out there, the Blue-Fur Lady is probably still drinking the blood of children, and Dr. Seward is insane. So things don't go necessarily the way they did in the book, but that is roughly how the story ends. The epilogue in the original is much more domestic. It's much more focused on the fact that the Harkers now have a kid, and they named him after Quincey, and they're still in touch with the surviving members of the vampire hunting group, and it's all very cozy and sweet, and really just the warmest, fuzziest thing that could possibly be used to end a Gothic novel. But no, in this version, it's just sort of mentioned that the whole vampire conspiracy fell apart a bit, and all the people involved just left the country in a hurry, and nobody gets arrested. Quincey doesn't get arrested for killing Dracula. And that's Markt Mirkana, The Powers of Darkness. I hope you've enjoyed this summary of this very interesting book. And I hope that, if anything, it inspires you to write that unhinged fanfiction that you've always wanted to write. Because if Valdemar Ausmundsson can do it, so can you. Thank you so much for watching, and my apologies to Valdemar Ausmundsson and Bram Stoker. Enjoy your weekend.